The tension in the world of mixed martial arts had been simmering for weeks, but now, it was at a boiling point. Quinton Rampage Jackson, a name that once sent shivers down the spines of his opponents in the UFC's light heavyweight division, had erupted into a furious, expletive-laden rant that sent shockwaves through the community. His anger was directed squarely at Anthony Smith, a man still clinging to the last threads of his fighting career, a warrior determined to step into the octagon for one final battle before calling it quits. But before he could lace up his gloves for that one last fight, he had unknowingly walked into a storm, one that Rampage was more than willing to unleash upon him. It all started with a podcast, an unassuming place where fighters, past and present, shared their thoughts, experiences, and sometimes, their unfiltered opinions. Rampage Jackson, long removed from the octagon but never far from the spotlight, had made his presence known in the podcasting world, bringing his raw, unapologetic personality to the mic. His show had drawn plenty of attention, not all of it positive. The recent drama had been set off when an episode featuring Bryce Mitchell, a rising UFC featherweight, mysteriously disappeared soon after its release, leaving fans speculating about the reasons behind its removal. Then came TJ Dillashaw, the former bantamweight champion, who stirred the pot even further by declaring that Kevin Holland, a brash and talented fighter, would never wear UFC gold. And in a single breath, he lumped Anthony Smith into that same category, dismissing his chances of ever becoming a world champion. Smith, a fighter who had spent years grinding through the ranks, took issue with the way the podcast handled its guests. He had been there himself, laughing and sharing stories, believing he was in the company of men who respected him. But months later, as he tuned in, he heard his name being tossed around in ridicule, his accomplishments belittled. It wasn't just him either. He had seen it happen before, fighters brought onto the show, treated with respect to their faces, only to be mocked later when they weren't around to defend themselves. Ian Gary had been another victim, invited to appear on the podcast after being insulted on a previous episode. Smith, never one to shy away from speaking his mind, called out the show for what it was. His words struck a nerve. Rampage Jackson was many things: an entertainer, a legend, a man who had built a career on raw aggression, but he was not one to sit idly by when his name was dragged through the mud. The moment he caught wind of Smith's accusations, something inside him ignited, a familiar fire from his fighting days roaring back to life. And when he took to his podcast, there was no holding back. "I'm telling y'all," Rampage's voice boomed, every word dripping with venom. "All you soft-ass motherf out there, y'all need to chill the F out and quit being little b." His words cut through the air like a blade, sharp and unfiltered. "Yeah, TJ shouldn't say nobody shouldn't be AF champion," he continued, acknowledging the controversy surrounding Dillashaw's comments. "But that's TJ. I respect him for that. He's standing on business. He's one of the greatest to ever do it in his motherf weight class. Some of you guys are just B." But then, the true rage came spilling out. His voice grew harsher, his words more pointed. "This has got me pee off," he seethed. "I'm going to tell that Anthony Smith motherf, call that motherf up, tell him to keep my motherf name out of his motherf mouth." Then came the threat, the promise of confrontation. "I see his BA, I'm going to smack the F out of him." The declaration sent ripples through the MMA world. This wasn't just some online spat, a war of words between keyboard warriors. This was personal. Rampage wasn't a man known for empty threats, and if he said he was going to smack Anthony Smith, people believed he meant it. For Smith, the situation was a complex one. He had spoken out, not out of malice, but because he believed fighters deserve better. He had looked up to Rampage for years, even called him his favorite fighter, but now that admiration had turned to something else: disappointment, maybe even betrayal. He had stood up for what he believed in, but in doing so, he had awoken a sleeping giant, a man whose fury had not diminished with time. The tension between them was palpable, hanging in the air like a storm cloud ready to burst. What had started as a simple critique had now spiraled into something much bigger, something that threatened to spill out of the realm of podcasts and social media into the real world. Would Rampage follow through on his threat? Would this war of words escalate into something physical? The MMA world watched, waiting, wondering if this feud would reach a boiling point either man could walk away from unscathed. If Anthony Smith had any regrets about speaking his mind, he didn't show them. He had made his stance clear, and no amount of shouting or threats from Rampage Jackson was going to change that. But as the echoes of Rampage's furious rant continued to reverberate through the fight world, one thing was certain: this was far from over. The fallout from Rampage Jackson's explosive tirade spread like wildfire. Within hours, clips of his X-rated rant were circulating across social media, dissected and analyzed by fans, fighters, and pundits alike. Some dismissed it as just another example of Rampage's brash, unfiltered personality, an old lion roaring to remind the world he was still dangerous. Others, however, saw something different. There was venom in his words, a raw, unrestrained anger that suggested he wasn't just playing for the cameras. This was personal. Anthony Smith, for his part, remained composed. He had heard the threats, the insults, the taunts meant to break him down. But he had also spent a lifetime in this sport, fighting through blood, sweat, and heartbreak. He wasn't about to be rattled by words alone. Yet, beneath his calm exterior, there was a storm brewing, a deep frustration that had been simmering for some time. He hadn't set out to pick a fight with Rampage, hadn't intended to become the target of his fury. But if this was the road they were going down, he wasn't about to back away. The feud wasn't just about a few harsh words on a podcast. It was about something bigger: respect. Smith had never claimed to be the best in the world. He had always been a realist about his career, about his limitations. He had fought the toughest men in the sport, tested himself against legends, and had come up short more times than he cared to admit. But he had never disrespected the grind, never taken cheap shots at his fellow fighters. That's why Rampage's podcast had rubbed him the wrong way. It wasn't about personal insults, it was about principle. The sport was hard enough without fighters tearing each other down for entertainment. But Rampage Jackson had never been one to play by the rules of decorum. He was from a different era, a time when fighters settled their differences in the cage, not on podcasts. And as far as he was concerned, Smith had crossed a line by questioning his integrity. That's why his rage had been so visceral, his threats so pointed. Behind closed doors, there were whispers that this might not stay a war of words for long. It wasn't out of the realm of possibility. Rampage might have been retired, but he wasn't the kind of man to turn the other cheek when he felt disrespected. If he ran into Smith at a UFC event, at a gym, or even on the street, there was no telling what might happen. The thought alone was enough to make fight fans salivate. 2 generations of warriors, one still fighting for his legacy, the other refusing to let his fade. Dana White, the UFC president, was no stranger to heated rivalries. He had seen plenty of fighters clash outside the cage, sometimes leading to blockbuster matchups inside it. But this situation was different. Rampage was done with professional fighting, or at least, that's what everyone thought. But what if he wasn't? What if this feud reignited something inside him, a fire that had been dimmed by years of inactivity? And what about Smith? Would he take the bait? Would he respond in kind, pushing this conflict past the point of no return? For now, there were no clear answers, only questions. What was certain, however, was that this wasn't the last time these 2 names would be spoken in the same breath. The next move could come at any moment: another rant, another call-out, or something more tangible, more physical. All the world could do was wait and watch as the storm gathered on the horizon, knowing that when it finally broke, there would be no turning back.